Hello and welcome back to my RC channel. I'm Andy RC and today I'm taking a look at the Uruav 85. This is a 1.9 inch brushless micro and I would not call it a whoop myself. For me, whoops stop at 1S and realistically in my sized house no bigger than the 65mm size, although 75mm can be flown indoors but I don't find them as fun. So for me the 85mm size and above is more of a backyard outdoor flyer on a calm day, or perhaps in a sports hall or a big warehouse. And rather than these being ducts, they are more protectors for somebody newer to the hobby. In case you hit something or someone, then you're not going to cause any damage other than to your pride and ego. Now what's interesting is they do a HD version of this model, but that's a completely different class to me, because when you add the weight of a Cadex Turtle camera, then you are kind of limited in terms of power to weight, and they have some strange flight characteristics, sometimes referred to as yaw washout. I just call it not having enough power, and people call those types of models cine whoops. And as this doesn't have a HD camera, it's just got an analog FPV camera, then this isn't a cine whoop either. So it comes with a 300 mAh 3S LiPo rated from 40 to 80C, and the model's all-up weight is only 67 grams. I have to say though, the HD version's weight doesn't look too bad if it's correctly listed at 76 grams, and that's including a battery. But I don't have that, so the only one I can really compare it to is the Beta FPV 85X, and that came in at like 115 grams, so the HD version of this model might be worth a look at. I think they've actually achieved a lower weight by using a lighter frame. The frame doesn't really feel weak though, and it's got a lot of struts around it to strengthen it up. I have to say that the frame has this battery holder and it's quite a tight fit. I can already see strains in the plastic where perhaps it's been put under too much pressure, which is maybe why they have provided a battery strap in case this breaks. Although I'm not quite sure how you would use it. The model will run off a 2S LiPo, and these 300 mAh GMB LiPos fit nicely in the slot, albeit sideways, but the 450 mAh 2S ones from GMB don't fit. They also provide a PH2JST series connector to an XT30 if you want to get 2S that way, so you'd use two 1S LiPos in series. But I think they have lost some weight with the motors too, because these are an 805 9000 kV naked bottom brushless motor, and they have silicon wires, which is always nice to see. The HD version has 1103 motors if I remember correctly. The props look like the old King Kong tension fitted 1.9 inch prop, and you are given a spare set of those as well as a prop remover, and they don't feel loose, they are on really strong, so I don't see those flying off at all. I think these props actually might be part of the secret to the potential success of this model, because there's quite a gap between the leading edge of the prop and the protectors, and I think that will allow for better airflow down the blade to stop it doing any silly maneuvers on its own. The motors connect to the Crazy Bee all-in-one F4 V2 flight controller via JST connectors, so if you have a motor burnout, then it's easy to replace them, although it's more likely that you'll have an ESC burnout. Now I hear that there is a risk of the 5-volt regulator burning out on these Crazy Bee boards when you use an XT30 from the voltage spike that is caused by the lower resistance of an XT30 connector. So if you are interested in this model, or in fact any model that is using a Crazy Bee flight controller, then they recommend adding a 100 microfarad capacitor. I think Happy Model actually sell them as an optional extra. This one doesn't have one though, so hopefully I'll still be able to fly it. You should also be aware that the version of Betaflight shipped with my model is a release candidate of Betaflight 4. So if you have upgraded to the latest Betaflight configurator, then clicking the Modes tab will lock up Betaflight completely, and some of the other functions won't work either. So you have two options. You either stick with the 10.4 version of the Betaflight configurator and everything will work fine, or upgrade the target to the latest version of Betaflight 4, but then you will lose all of the settings that the manufacturer has put in there, because the release candidate of Betaflight 4 and the official version of Betaflight 4 are quite a bit different to each other. So you might as well start from scratch. So let me give you a reason to update to the latest version of Betaflight 4, but also give you a reason to stick with the version that it comes with. So the Crazy Bee boards have a built-in SPI receiver. This means that it doesn't require a spare UART to connect a receiver up to. In the same way that most Betaflight boards have a built-in on-screen display now, that's also done via SPI. This is great because not only is the receiver built into the board, but it means that you can have FrSky D16 with working telemetry, or D8 on the same board. You can also have FlySky targets and Spectrum targets. However, up to Betaflight 4, there's been an error in the coding for the telemetry in D16. Now, I don't think this has been the case for all versions of Betaflight up to version 4, because I run my UK65 on D16 and don't have any issues. But what other people have been finding is that you will get what appear to be random failsafes, and in some cases complete lockups when using D16 mode. So you would have to disconnect the battery and then reconnect it in order to get your bind back. So this bug has been fixed in Betaflight version 4.02, but as I mentioned, you will pretty much have to start from scratch in terms of setup if you upgrade to that, because some of the syntax has changed and the PIDs work differently. And I wasn't too impressed with the setup of this guy anyways. I mean, I've seen worse, but air mode wasn't selected, the digital idle was too low, and this model comes with a high volt Lipo, but it was only set up to accept 4.3 volts per cell, and a high volt is 4.35, so you have to up that, otherwise sometimes it won't arm because it's saying no, that battery voltage is too high, so I'm not gonna let it on. So I'd stick that up to about 4.6 volts. I think the PIDs are just stock PIDs anyways, and there is no buzzer on this model, and D-Shot beacon wasn't selected. The on-screen display was okay, but I had to move a few things around to suit my needs, so there's a good argument to upgrade. However, really all the telemetry does is send information to your transmitter, which you can also get through your on-screen display. Alright, you can use Lua scripts to change the PIDs and the VTX power, but you can also do that through the on-screen displays menu as well. So if you don't want to mess about upgrading and aren't fussed about telemetry, then just run the receiver in D8 mode and you won't get these dropouts, because the D8 protocol doesn't send the telemetry back to your transmitter and you won't get these random lockups and failsafes. One thing I will say is that the antenna on these boards is so tiny anyways, and from my experience, whether in D16 mode or D8, the range is around about 100 meters. So really, it all depends on your preference which way you want to go. But to change to D8 mode, you have to select FrSky_D in the config tab. And by the way, it still sends the RSSI to your on-screen display in D8 mode. You just have to make sure that you have the RSSI disabled, because it all does it through the SPI rather than an aux channel. And I should mention the D16 version is FCC only, but D8 is on both EU and non-EU FrSky transmitters, at least until the access protocol comes into play. Then you'll have to have a separate module for D8. I think if you buy the EU version, they actually send an XM Plus receiver with it instead of using the built-in SPI receiver. I think I'd recommend doing that anyways. They sell it as a plug and fly, so whether it's EU or FCC you're after, then you will get more range with an XM Plus, and I'll talk about why that's important in a bit. I've mentioned this before, but a benefit of the SPI receiver is that you don't have to mess around holding down the bind button while plugging in the battery. You plug the battery in first, or the USB connector, and after a couple of seconds you can hold down the bind button and it will send it into bind mode. You can also bind from the CLI, and there is a bootloader button next to the bind button, which is quite handy if you are struggling flashing the firmware. The ESCs are built into the board, and they are 5 amp each with a 6 amp burst, and the board has a built-in current meter, so it will be interesting to see how many amps this one pulls. So above that we have the VTX, which is switchable from 25 milliwatt up to 200 milliwatt via smart audio, and that's why I would personally stick a better receiver on there, because on the 200 milliwatt setting your control range is going to drop out way before your video, so there's a spare UART for a receiver. Now, I don't like how the linear antenna has no adhesive on it, and the board itself is only held on by 2 screws, so it moves around a lot. I can see the antenna popping off in a crash and would kill the VTX pretty quickly. You can control the VTX manually via a button on the side, but why bother when you can use smart audio? You need a screwdriver to get to it, and it doesn't save the channel if you use the button and smart audio is enabled at the same time, because it's going to favor smart audio. And I don't think the button puts it into pit mode either, as far as I can tell from the instructions. Then lastly we have the Cadex EOS Cmos camera. Now this camera in the past has had problems with jello, but I think that's just how it's been mounted in previous models. It's mounted nicely here, and you can actually tilt the camera down as well as up to about 50 degrees. The model comes in this nice case. You get a manual which gives you a lot of information, but it's really worth reading up about Betaflight to get the best out of this model. There are some spare screws and a screwdriver, so let's go and see how this thing flies. Okay, let's check out what this guy is like. Line of sight. And it's a flat calm day here today. Starting off in angle mode and everything seems fine. This is really just to show you how much punch this thing has got, so let's go for it. Oh yeah, plenty of punch. Of course I won't know if it starts to do any strange maneuvers that these models are known for doing until I start doing FPV, because you're moving forward when doing FPV, and when you're flying line of sight really you are just hovering, so you can do rolls nicely, you can do loops nicely, and there are no problems. But I've got a good feeling about this one. Sounds really smooth. Haven't done anything to the tune, because you never know what is going to happen if you do so, and I like to fly them as stock as possible. Usually just change my rates, but this guy is behaving. So I think the Lipo is the same 3S Lipo that you get, or that I got with the Mobula 7. So it doesn't have a huge C rating, but maybe it's not needed with this model. You see, this one is a lot lighter because it's not carrying a HD camera, you see, which fares well for how it might fly FPV. But anyways, We'll do one more punch out with this guy. Bags of power. But let's see how it gets on to an FPV. So I actually chose to do the FPV flight on a different day because I thought the lighting situation on that particular day wouldn't reveal any jello. So we've got a bright sunny day here, and I'm happy to say that there is no jello and the picture is absolutely awesome. This is a 16:9 camera though, so bear that in mind. I don't think you would get a good result using 4x3 goggles. The tune was pretty nice. It needs a little bit of work, but I'm going to do a punch here. Let's look at the amps. So 15 amps there, and we are well within the tolerance there, because if these ESCs can do a 6 amp peak each, then that's 24 amps. So yeah, we've got no problems there. Also, you'll notice no voltage sag really either. That was completely different when I had this battery on the Mobula 7, obviously a smaller model and heavier, and the battery sagged like crazy and I didn't recommend it. Now I'm trying to get through a gap here. It's quite a small gap, and you will see that it is much more clumsy to get through the smaller gaps. Now some of that is my talent, but definitely the smaller models obviously are easier to get through the smaller gaps. But I'm happy to see that there isn't any breakup, and yeah, look at the voltage there. It's remaining at a nice stable voltage, 11 volts, and on a punch out you can see it doesn't drop below 10, so you'd want to be landing at about 10 volts with this one, and it's not dropping below 10 volts. And look at this as well, we're getting slight wobbles, but I can put it into any maneuver and I cannot trick it out. It's not doing yaw washout, it's not pitching backwards on its own, and I just think that's because it is light and it's got enough power, and also maybe that little gap between the protectors and the props are actually benefiting it, because yeah, it flies perfect. So yeah, I think I would recommend this Copter. Look at the RSSI though, as I'm going away from myself, it's in the 30s here. So yeah, this is where I think, you know, the 200 milliwatt perhaps is a little bit overkill. But look at this, just put it into a complete dive there, and no high maintenance maneuvers at the end of it to try and get out of it. It just flies nice. Like I say, I do think the PIDs need changing a little bit. Also, the current meter is accurate, so if you look here, it's reading 244 milliamps there, and we're just getting to 10 volts, but that's because I'm up and down on the throttle. So as I come down on the throttle, you'll see the voltage will recover slightly. So yeah, not a bad flight time either. I think just over a 4-minute flight time. But as the battery voltage has reduced now to around about 10 volts or so, I'm just keeping it in close because I want to see how much flight time I can get out of it and when it starts dropping below 10 volts. So we're exactly at 10 volts and we saw 9.9 there. At this point you should land really, but again you can see the voltage has gone up again. And there we go, 300 milliamps at 9.9 or 10 volts. Now, I keep going on for a little bit. I would not recommend that. I'm just seeing what I can get out of this battery and what flight time I can get out of it. But you should be landing at this point. But yeah, I have to say, impressed with this model. I think it'd be good for a beginner. I think I managed to hit a gap here before I come in for a landing. So I'll put a link in the description if you wish to get one. And as always, thanks so much for watching. Please continue to subscribe. Cheers.